About 2 years ago, Peter started emailing me saying he would love to come and visit with us. Did we have any role for visiting scholars here? What might be possible? I tried to explain to him that it's pretty quiet in between sessions when you all aren't here, and that maybe a first step would be to come and visit with us for a single session. So I'm very, very happy to introduce to you somebody who is reaching toward depth psychology from the area of community development, in which he's had many years of experience. He's a senior lecturer in community development within the School of Social Science at the University of Queensland in Australia, a research fellow at the University of the Free State, South Africa, and director of Community Praxis, a non-profit cooperative based in Australia. And he has done work in many countries: Australia, the Philippines, Vanuatu, South Africa, Papua New Guinea, and has written a really beautiful book trying to bring out the dialogical foundations of community development work that are very much in line with the kind of participatory and dialogical approach that we teach here. And I'm very happy to say he's just finished a book where he fully walked the bridge to depth psychology. It's called Soul, Community and Social Change, Theorizing a Soul Perspective on Community Practice. So he will be able to share with you the way in which people in the development arena, some of them, are very eager to learn about depth psychology because it's a missing chord in their work. And with that, I turn it over to you, and thank you for your generosity in sharing with us.
Thanks, Mary. And it's delightful to finally meet Mary yesterday and share a small walk on the beach and lovely dinner. And delightful to sit for 3 hours this morning in a conversation with students and one of your teachers. And this feels odd, standing like this. And but I come from Brisbane, and or also what we in Australia know as Turrbal and Jagera country, which are the two nations within, upon which Brisbane is built. And we talk about our cultural bosses. Sam Watson, sort of the chair of the Indigenous Elders group of Brisbane, and he's still my cultural boss. And I don't know who your cultural bosses are on this land, but it's good to be here, and I acknowledge them. When I was kind of grappling with what to share, because it was like short talk, lots of options, Mary did say some stories of practice. So I kind of think I'm going to sort of play more in stories of practice space, and we've had a heavy theory morning, so that might work. But I'd like to take us on a brief journey of how, I guess, myself or community workers are grappling, community development practitioners are grappling with working across difference in communities. And I do that as a community development scholar, not as a depth psychology scholar and not as a philosopher. And I've chosen to do that because community development workers, particularly in the tradition I've been trained, try to work with those on the margins rather than those on the mainstream, which is kind of odd and ironic as a white heterosexual male standing up here. And I'm not generally of the margins, but I work in what is conceptualised as marginal spaces. But I was rereading some bell hooks the other day, and I figured that she would approve that one can bring one's humanity to any space, even if you represent many markers of the mainstream. And I really do want to just share, I do want to share some stories and kind of focus on two very simple concepts which you've done a lot of work with, that of radical hospitality and dialogue, and maybe share what we in community work think of as the method map or a method map, which might help some of you think about working in communities. And I'm conscious that even talking about hospitality and dialogue leaves so many gaps. What about other key ideas like critically engaging language, doing justice and solidarity? And I guess I'm focusing today more on ethics, the centrality of ethics and relationship in community work, whilst fully aware of all those issues of power and solidarity. And I guess I still see ethics as being somewhat at the heart of development work. I was saying to Ed over lunch, unfortunately, development practitioners and thinkers don't think philosophically. People tend to get trained. Most development practitioners now coming out with MBAs. The field of economics is dominant in development, and it's how do we reclaim those that claim to intervene in the world in big ways, that don't think about ethics much and certainly don't think philosophically. So I'm talking about ethics in that broadest sense of the ecology of relationships and how they work and interact. Okay, so let's start. Just this whole idea of radical hospitality. And the first story, very simple, very personal one. I, at the age of 19, went and located myself at the invitation of some Jesuit friends, even though I didn't come out of a Catholic background, to go and live in a slum or a shanty town in Metro Manila, down in the Philippines. This was just after the removal of Marcos, the dictator, and there was this sort of space where people could come and be. It was a bit safer. And I remember that at the age of 19, to suddenly be immersed in a space behind the flashy apartments that flooded when the rain came, because most shanty towns do flood when the rains come, was my first experience of encountering the other. It was the disruption in my life as a 19-year-old of white, heterosexual kind of mainstream. And it was my experience of what Levinas would think of as the other, a profoundly different world that shook me and started my journey. And I guess prior to that, sociologist Robert Putnam would say I had a good, strong, bonding social capital. Those who were like me were the people I hung out with. And suddenly, at 19, my world was disrupted. And radical hospitality, in many ways, is about that disruption in our lives. And how are we just hospitable to the family, if we like our family, and to people like us, our friends, or how do we extend that to those that challenge our world, who are different? And I still remember at 19 walking through that slum with young men holding my hands, asking in the first conversation, "Are you circumcised, Peter?" Now, I tell you, as a 19-year-old Australian boy, that had learned to defend himself in playgrounds in Australia, usually with fist fights, being asked, "Are you circumcised?" and having your hand held by men is a profoundly disrupting experience culturally. But I'm not in my space now, I'm in their space. I couldn't challenge the behaviours, the norms, so my world was undone, and many people in this room probably experience that disruption daily, but that was very new to me. And I also remember the next week, as I befriended wealthy Filipinos, having a Sunday lunch and then walking over a bridge, looking down on the slum that I was inhabiting, that they couldn't see the slum. It was invisible to them, because we don't see what we don't want to see. And that disrupted my world as well. And when I went back to Australia, I suddenly had been trained through that experience, or habituated in a different way, maybe to look a bit differently, because development work is often really about how we see. So, I kind of started to see boundaries. What, community is always about insiders and outsiders. It's always, Jacques Derrida, he was very uncomfortable with the word community. He identified, I think, the etymological roots of munitions, munition component of community. The community is actually about boundaries and warfare, and we commit genocide in the name of community. So community is a very complex term. I'd always seen it as a really positive thing, and I know I started to see the cracks, the insider-outsider dimensions. And I returned to West End, Brisbane. It's a neighbourhood I still live in after 28 years. It's a neighbourhood in inner city Brisbane. It's where a lot of Indigenous people live. It's where a lot of refugees have lived historically. It's also a place where people with mental illness were dumped, and I use the word, after our deinstitutionalisation process in Australia. We deinstitutionalised big places where people with mental illness were put. They were put back into community, but with minimal support. And in my new ability to see, mainly, and along with others that had made an intentional effort to do community work with those on the margins, we realised there was this invisible group that were living in our neighbourhood. And so I kind of started experimenting with that other element of hospitality, and that is, how do you lurk with intent? And I use that word quite carefully. How do you lurk with intent nearby those that you would like to get to know, but don't feel you have a right to intrude into? So literally, we would hang out near the hostels where these people lived. We pretty quickly learned that the only two visitors to those hostels were the doctors who would drug people up and the social worker who would monitor their health. But there was no, they were located in the geography of community, but there was no relational element to community. They were not connected in any way. And so we started to lurk, and gradually conversations emerged. And gradually we were invited into people's lives, and we started to do what we think of in community development as micro method, and I'll kind of talk a bit about the method map at the end. But the micro method is the very one-on-one relational elements of listening, hearing stories, trying to understand people's lives without holding your own agenda very lightly. We all have agendas. If you're going to go and do your research fieldwork, you have an agenda to learn. But how do you hold your agenda lightly and be present to people's stories as they unfold? This is what we think of as micro method. So this kind of experiences of hospitality or radical hospitality. One hand, me experiencing profound disruption through being located in Manila, and then how do we reach out to those who are invisible, profoundly marginalised? So how do we become hospitable and put ourselves in spaces where people might welcome us into our lives? And there's an intentionality behind that to do with justice. So these are people without justice. So these are kind of two of the kind of practitioner that my journey in this. But of course there's the whole, it's very complex, and I was thinking, I've been working in South Africa for 20 years, and last year just published a book looking at community development in South Africa and how it's playing out as a discursive and material practice. And one of the very interesting elements is that on one hand you have a history of apartheid-led community development. Community development is not in its essence a liberatory, emancipatory practice. It's been used by the state all around the world, by NGOs, to colonise and control. And in South Africa, in fact, the Prime Minister, P.W. Botha, prior to become the Prime Minister of apartheid South Africa, was the Minister of Community Development. And, they basically orchestrated what's called separate development, where black people were removed forcibly from their homes and relocated into Baptistans, which are kind of poor, marginal areas of South Africa. So community development is problematic. However, there's quite a strong emancipatory tradition of community development in South Africa, of which Steve Biko, I don't know if any of you remember Steve Biko, he represented that. He read Paulo Freire's 1971 Pedagogy to the Oppressed, and the English version in 1972. Read it, was impressed with it, and started what was called the Black Community Programs, which was a black community development program, explicitly run by blacks, black doctors, black managers. And Biko said, we want to run it ourselves because we understand poverty as a structural process of capital accumulation and a cultural process. And he was reading Fanon as well. But of course, at the end of 72, in the midst of starting those programs, Biko was murdered by the state. But the tradition lived on, and it's flourishing in South Africa now. And that's kind of a long introduction to saying one of the interesting things about some of the really powerful processes of community development in South Africa is that the autonomous organisations that are not wanting NGOs or the state or development practitioners to come in and do anything. They're organising in a way that says, we are autonomous, stay away. And so there's limits to radical hospitality, and I guess that's what I wanted to say. As a community development practitioner and thinker, I always tell my students, you can lurk with intent, but when you're told to stay away, stay away. You know, there's a deep respect here that, you know, but those that are on the margins do not always want those on the mainstream to enter. And there are deep reasons for that, which we'll come back to. I think of Gustavo Esteva, the Mexican, development scholar, who really is leading the fight against development as intervention and trying to rethink development as hospitality and as a process of co-motion between those that have access to resources, confidence, networks, and those that are trying to build confidence, networks, resources, and how they interact with all the problematics. So that's about hospitality. So then the dialogue, and obviously dialogue sits in all those stories because hospitality and dialogue are kind of sit together. Dialogue in many ways represents my lifelong journey, and coming back to that West End story and working with people with mental health issues, when we think of micro-method in community development, which is the method of dialogue, we enter the worlds of those on the margins, trying to listen, try to hear their stories, to stay with the text, not the commentary, people's lived experience and the way they describe it, not our interpretation of how they describe it. Very easy to say, very hard for us to do. And the harder it becomes, the more trained you are in colleges and universities, let me say, because you become trained in interpreting other people's lives and you become experts, and expertise can be duly damaging in our work. So unless we become experts at seeing and seeing how we see, we can become really dangerous, and this is crucial to development practice. Of course, the challenge of seeing is profound. There are many pressures and forces working against us seeing what is in front of us and hearing people's stories. We interpret people's worlds through our own lenses. We become loaded with theory, and theory is wonderful because we can't see the world without theory. But theory is profoundly dangerous, as Hannah Arendt, great political scientist, reminds us constantly, because theory can make us blind to seeing as well. We only see the theory. And of course there are the simple institutional pressures, particularly in development work. I don't know if any of you have worked in development work. It's lovely doing a thesis. You don't have many time pressures, but when you're in development work there are time pressures. The rationalists, the measurements, the people who run development world have very limited time frames. So, you don't have time to listen, hear stories, build participatory relational ways of being with people. So we're under lots of pressure. And when we're under pressure, we do what we do. We leap to abstractions. We quickly interpret the world based on our previous interpretations and experiences of it. And we no longer see what is unfolding, the complex social phenomena that is unfolding in front of us. And I'd suggest that leap to the abstract is actually often the largest danger in our work. The quick leap to the abstract. We only see the refugee. We're working with refugees. We only see people with mental health problems, the label, the abstract. We only see a Muslim. We only see a Christian. We download then our theories, as Otto Scharmer in his Thinking About You theory. We download theories quickly, and we're not able to hear the story and become present to what's unfolding in front of us. So the challenge could be framed as abstracting versus presencing, with the latter focused on how practitioners or inquirers can be present to the story and sensing what is happening in their world or not happening. And I bring that up because in being conscious about how we see is obviously the phenomenological story, and how phenomenology has helped us really grapple with this question of seeing in different ways, not just the analytical way that we're used to seeing, but actually entering into a curious, intimate, compassionate, participatory way of seeing, which disrupts us and makes us open. So the difficulties of dialogue are linked to these practical issues, these phenomenological issues and these structural issues. But in this space of dialogue, I don't know if you've ever used Martin Buber's work, the German philosopher, and I draw on his work a lot, and his very simple framing of I-it versus I-thou in terms of the attitudes of dialogue. He also gives us good frameworks for the technicalities of dialogue, which I won't have time to look at. But in his attitudinal work, it's I think of a fourth story that I could share, and it's linked to the late mid-90s. I was leading a community development team in an NGO in Brisbane called the Queensland Torture Trauma Clinic. So basically we were the organisation responsible for working with refugees that experienced torture and trauma. El Salvador, Cambodia, Vietnam, Chile, Bosnia, former Yugoslavia. And then during the late 90s, Somalis, Sudanese. And I was leading the work with the Somali Sudanese community. And as a community worker, and in a public meeting, the Sudanese elders stood up and criticised profoundly what our NGO was doing in terms of providing clinical counselling, therapeutic services to those communities. And many of the professionals, I was sharing with Mary last night, reacted, to that criticism in a public meeting by the elders of that community. And I, as a community worker, I said, no, this is wonderful. I mean, if there's enough safety for people to criticise what we're doing, we've made some progress. Let's build on that. But I'm the community worker, that's my job. So open the dialogue. And what I realised in the dialogue over the next 2 years, and we called it a Dialogue in Healing initiative, was that most NGOs were operating with the African communities in a monological way. Subject-object, and I-it. It's a community. We will do what we've always done, we'll kind of use transcultural psychology and we'll, send people off to specialists if need be. But generally the model of service delivery was what had been delivered all along. And once we opened dialogue up, we realised there was a whole set of cultural archives about Sudanese healing and Somali healing. Fragments of archives, but different ways that people wanted our NGO to support their models of healing or their rediscovery of their models of healing, because it's not about just remembering, it's actually about rediscovery in many ways. So that kind of represented an I-thou approach. So coming back to that Buber, I-it, object-subject, where we relate to groups in the same way we always have, or people in the same way, whereas the I-thou is this intersubjective dialogical approach, and it's a very simple but profound shift, but obviously profoundly important in practice, but requires the constant remaking of practice, which is exhausting and tiring for, when you're working in NGOs, working with so many groups as well. So, and obviously sitting behind that are really problematic questions. Why are we even working with the Sudanese community? Why are they Sudanese? Why are they a community? Why are we making choices to work in ethnic categories at all, and not looking at solidarity amongst class-positioned refugee groups and building solidarities with other groups? So, those were questions that came up in the dialogues. And healing we started to conceptualise healing through the lens of culture, community and power, and look at strategies around issues to do with cultural rediscovery, the remaking of community in a new country, and issues to do with solidarity and community organising in terms of power. So a Sudanese model of healing, very different to a clinical or even, I guess, a culturally sensitive model. So I'm almost at the end, because what is the time? We're getting there, yeah. So the question behind that, of course, is, are we really open to dialogue? Because it is constantly challenging, it's constantly undoing us. And I think the fifth story I wanted to tell is, in the last 11 years I've been working in the nation of Vanuatu. Has anyone heard of Vanuatu? It's okay. I did sit with a bunch of people in Oxford University, the Refugee Studies Centre, of which probably this size group. A third were working for the United Nations, and they hadn't heard of Vanuatu either. And I was a bit distressed by that, because Vanuatu is a nation. It's a member of the United Nations, the nation of 250,000 people, sitting next to Solomon Islands, near Papua New Guinea. Anyway, it's there. What's intriguing about this story from a dialogical frame is the way it started and then continued, and it's just worth giving you a brief account. So in 2003, Dr. Anne Brown, who was my boss at that time at the Australian Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies, was at a conference in Port Vila, the capital of Vanuatu, and she decided, based on instinct, maybe it's not instinct, but and I was going to say a commitment to decolonising practice, but after our workshop this morning, I don't even know how to frame that. But to pay a visit to the Vanuatu National Council of Chiefs, which are the official customary custodians of the nation, sitting alongside Parliament, which is the modern democratic form of governance in that nation. And she simply wanted to pay respects. She had absolutely no agenda but to go and say, I'm at your country. I was welcomed by the immigration officers and your Prime Minister, but I wanted to come down here and pay respect to you. And in doing that and meeting Chief Selwyn Garu, the paramount chief of Vanuatu, he just sat there and went, no one's ever done this. No one from your country, Australia, who are the bully boys of the West Pacific nations. I don't know about your relationship in your part of the Pacific, but we're the bully boys. Our aid money basically determines a lot of what goes on, and we're not considered respectful. But he was blown away that she would do that, and sat her down and said, you know, I've never dared say this to a white person, but we're feeling a bit lost. We need help. Can you work with us? And she was like, oh, what do you mean? And the conversation started about this customary group that are responsible for maintaining peace in the nation. This is a nation where the state is very shadowy. There are no police on the islands where the majority of people live. There's no police stations. Peace is still the responsibility of custom and customary leaders. Can you help us? Because we're starting to struggle with how to maintain the peace. And because globalisation is shifting things rapidly, you know. And she said, well, we have some conversations. Anyway, a conversation started. Eventually the Council of Chiefs came back to us. They said, we would like you to go to AusAid, our equivalent of your USAID, and get money for a training capacity building intervention initiative into our communities around customary conflict resolution, development and rebuilding governance structures. And we said, well, we're happy to work with you, but that sounds problematic because we don't have any capacity to work in your country. How could we possibly be doing capacity building? But so let's open a conversation about what we could do together. And I remember being responsible in the meeting to start that dialogue about, we're not going to do a capacity building training intervention. What are we going to do? And I remember just saying, can you just talk us through what the words training, education, capacity mean in Bishlama, which is your language. Let's put these words on the table. And what emerged from that was just this energy as people started to unpack what their own language might mean in terms of the help they wanted, rather than the framing in terms of training, capacity building, intervention. And we came up with a wonderful initiative, at least on paper, built around the idea of partnership and built around the idea of storians, which is a Bishlama word for storytelling and dialogue. And AusAid, to their credit, resourced it for 11 years. Unheard of, and it became good practice in terms of working with these kind of partnership models. So it was led by the National Council of Chiefs, and we facilitated about 60 5-day conversations across the islands with chiefs, women, youth and religious leaders, the 4 pillars of leadership in that part of the world, around how do we rebuild customary conflict resolution systems that integrate what is still working from our past but brings in the new? How do we integrate governance structures that are both, represent the archive that you still have in place, but some of the Western ideas, but on your terms about what's needed? And how do we have the difficult conversations about development issues, the kind of development that people want? So a wonderful story, and represents what dialogue can do, but the difficulty of the practice and what is required. So sitting behind that in terms of the practice, and this is where I guess I come to the conclusion, and we can have a few questions. And it's a method map, and it's the map that I keep in my head in my practice all the time, and it's nowhere near as sophisticated as the method maps that we could have drawn out of this morning. But it's this very simple notion that within our work, in community development work, we're always doing this micro method. And it's that method of relational work, one-on-one. We can never let go of this being the heart of the work. As Tagore would say, Rabindra Tagore, the Bengali poet and leader in educational reform, it's how do we see what the people see? How do we really grapple with people's experiences? What Martin Buber talks about as dialogue. It's what Paulo Freire talks about as working with love. Freire talked about love a lot. So this is at the heart of the work. It's the one-on-one work. This is the meso component of the method. Oh, the pen's not working. But if that's the one-on-one relationship, the meso method is when you bring a few together. In community development, it's not about you doing any service, not about you bringing the analysis of what should be done. It's about bringing a few people together and creating the conversations that enable the group to build the analysis of what needs to be done. It's the engine room, the heartbeat of community development work. And it's our capacity as development practitioners, as community workers, as animators, whatever you want to call yourself, to not bring solutions to group, but hold the process of bringing people, and usually they know who those people are. You just have to say, well, why don't you get the 3 or 4 people together? And in that last project of the Vanuatu story, this was the paramount chief and 2 or 3 of the other chiefs sitting in a room. This is discussing what are the words associated with, training, capacity building. That's where this work really, really turns. So, you can't, in community development work, one-on-one, you can't do much with one-on-one. That's private work in many ways. We think of that as what the counsellors do, the therapists do. But in community work, the big moves are I to we, because community work's collective. And from private to public. It's taking what are private issues that are managed internally or in therapeutic processes into public action. And it starts to happen here. What are we going to do about this? How are we going to take this into the public realm? So that's the meso method. And the macro method, which doesn't always occur, this can actually just stay here, is the structuring of that work into community or peoples-based organisations. It's a simple process of this only works when there's maybe 7, 8, 9 people. It's participatory. There's an intimacy, a trust. There's politics, but it's robust enough that you can resolve it. But if there's 50 people sitting in a room, you can't do that. You have to structure it. You have to structure it into people's organisations that are democratic. They can't be participatory very much. They have to be democratic, and the struggle becomes a democratic struggle rather than a participatory struggle. So that's where you organise. And then here, the meta method, and that is the linking of people's organisations into networks, alliances, federations, coalitions, because we know increasingly that most issues can't be dealt with at a local level. It has to be across localities and increasingly internationally. And actually some of our more progressive NGOs now put most of their resources into supporting federations or those kind of alliances. And this is how the fishermen or fisher folk of the world are tackling industrial fishing that's overfishing their coastlines through forming fishing alliances and taking on those industrial sort of conglomerates. So this is kind of a map, but it's a nested map because this flows right through it all. As the practitioner, you always, whether we're at this space or this space, we're constantly involved in the process of relational, dialogical work. Okay, so I think that's enough for a small talk.
Beautiful, thank you. Questions, comments?
Thank you. So yeah, we didn't touch on anything related to eco-psychology or depth psychology, but hopefully there's some...
I used to read a lot on Buber, and tell me if you have a couple of minutes to elaborate, because he always emphasizes the with his relationship with God was his focus, and you're bringing that a little further. I just want to know how you bring that in terms of dialogue with people. Is it that intimate relationship part, or versus proposing?
Well, actually, my interpretation or my reading of Buber, his profound aha moment, where he kind of thought about I there, was an encounter with his horse. Yeah, right. that he'd been interacting with his pet, his horse, as a labour, an animal of labour, and then one day he looked the horse in the eye, and something happened. And it moved him profoundly and shifted his relationship with the horse. He then does write a lot in his Judeo, tradition. Yeah. But he actually writes about I, thou in terms of dialogue in terms of human interaction in many ways. He says we're either having sex monologically or dialogically. We're having sex in an I-it way and an I-thou way. We go shopping in an I-it or an I-thou attitude, depending on how we relate to the people that we're exchanging with. So I'll find the sources for you if you want. Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yep.
You're talking about the meta level, and I've been intrigued about meta ethics in terms of including my unconscious with the other's unconscious. And so it seems like you're working at the level of dialogue, what is coming up in terms of what is gaining the level of consciousness. How do you address the unconscious?
I'm using meta in a profoundly different way. So I won't even try and answer that. I'm using meta as a way of thinking about method in development practice. So meta is simply a way of thinking beyond in sociological terms we think of micro, meso, macro. So there's sociological ways of using those words. In development language, we're using it at this federation building, alliance building level. So you've taken me into that question I would have no idea how to answer with any level of intelligibility. I'm sorry. Yeah.
How did you say that you are bringing the depth analysis part into these relations? Is it at the micro level, or are you? How is that entering into? At what place is that entering into the equation?
Well,
Would you say again what you understood the question is? So we all
where is the idea of depth coming into this? So, and you're using in the sense of depth psychology. Well, I haven't really tried to go there at all today. Look, I guess this is this new manuscript. In many ways, development scholars, if they're not dominated by economics, is dominated by social and political science. So what I'm trying to do is say, well, we still need to open space for myth and metaphor in the practice. I don't actually. I use the word soul, so I'm trying to work with the word soul more than the word depth. And actually, when I start to look at the word soul, Hillman has a significant contribution in terms of soul of the world, and that's very useful for community practice. But there's actually a strong critical tradition in social theory that uses soul as well. It's from people like Biffo Baridi, Italian, Nicholas Rose, who draws on Foucault's work, talks about governing the soul. So I'm actually grappling with the idea of soul in community work rather than what depth psychology. Okay? But the word soul, obviously Hillman's version of soul, which in many ways soul is very disruptive. It doesn't want to be held down. And so bringing soul into the world of practitioners, for me, see, I'm grappling with development practitioners. Development practitioners have certainty. They know what they want to do. They get trained in, go into a community, use assets-based community development approach, map the assets, or they get trained in sustainable livelihoods approaches. And I'm trying to disrupt it. I'm saying this is ridiculous. The phenomena in front of us is so much more complex than you bringing a model from an external world, an external agency, and thinking you can run an intervention and you will see change, transformation. You will see outputs that you'll be able to report on, but you won't see transformation. So for me, soul is about disrupting the models. It's becoming open to what unfolds. It's becoming present to the unofficial beneath the surface dynamics that actually is where transformation is taking place in most communities. And I start this book with a story. Here's the community development process. Here was the official story of what should happen and how it would be reported. But here's all the things that actually happened beneath the surface where transformation took place. So I think that's the depth stuff, if that makes sense. But I know I'm speaking to people who are experts on depth psychology, so I'm nervous. I mean, you guys have spent months, years thinking and talking about this. I haven't. I'm reading on the edges and trying to bring it into a mainstream body of theory development and disrupt. It's always tricky when scholars work at cross disciplines. It's a very scary space because you can't be expert on all of these things. But does that give an answer? Does that make sense?
No, it is. It's where we come from here, is keeping the soul mind and how it relates to community and how we can be change agents in that way. So very much so, I'll be interested to read your book. Thank you so much.
Well, I guess the other quick answer, because Hillman drew very much on phenomenology, I think, or a version of it. He was saying we have to look and keep looking at what is in front of us. And one of the most fascinating conversations I've been a part of for a few years is a global network of practitioners that are using Goethean science to rethink social practice. And I spent 5 days in a South African workshop last year, and we were grappling with the question of how does a practice, social practice, that foregrounds observation, contribute to healing in the world? And what we were grappling with is that in social development, community development, the polarity is observation, intervention. Our world is about polarities, structure, flexibility, intimacy, distance, hostility, hospitality. These are about polarities that we live with and work with, and how we conceptualise polarities determines in many ways how we structure our life. It's either or both and, or dialogically or dialectically or whatever. But the point is that the Western philosophy obviously has this will to action. We're big on intervention. We're sure. We act. We don't take any time to really observe. And for me, what Hillman brings beautifully is observe. And keep observing and see through. And we were talking over lunch that I was saying, is Foucault a phenomenologist? Because Foucault is actually about really looking in and through and looking at the conditions that create what we have now. And Ed assured me Foucault was not a phenomenologist. I wanted to claim it as a critical phenomenologist. But the point is that depth is about seeing. And then knowing in our seeing we're still blind and looking more. And being absolutely conscious we're blind. But in seeing, some kind of relationship unfolds that's different. I think maybe accessing the intuitive, holistic, ecological dimensions of who we are, as opposed to that very well-trained, analytical, separating component of what we are. And if we start to observe and keep observing, we start to access this other intuitive. And we see differently. We create a different relationship. And something unfolds differently in that different way of seeing. Anyway, we could go on. Any other?
Could you describe your observations of a transformational intervention as opposed to one based on a model? I mean, what do you observe when you work with results seeing through?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't think I know how to answer it. One of the chapters in this new book manuscript is a dialogue with Vern Harris, who's the Deputy Director of the Nelson Mandela Foundation in Johannesburg, dear friend of mine. And I actually said something about transformation, and he reacted in the dialogue. He says, in South Africa, transformation means this. Actually means the reorientation of the bureaucracy. In post-apartheid South Africa, so these are heuristic words, as Freire would say. They're words that evoke power and meaning, but none of us know what they mean unless we start to theorise them. So, transformation occurs at an individual level when something shifts. At a collective level, I'm not saying is transformation good? Is transformation different to change? How do we wade through these empty signifiers? I think it's a problematic word. I used it, didn't I, in my talk? Yeah.
Is there another word which you could use that would be more useful?
Oh, have you got one? We get stuck with language, don't we? We get so stuck with it. And because I've worked so long in South Africa, I'm kind of steeped in what it means there. And transformation means post-apartheid transformation, attempts to normalise whatever that means in a nation that's been brutalised for centuries. And in South Africa, I think the assessment right now is profound failure. I actually paused because I felt the grief of my colleagues and friends there that feel like they've failed miserably. The country is falling apart at this point. And the latest manifestation of that is, again, xenophobic violence of poor blacks, South Africans against even poorer refugees coming in from other African nations. So the transformational hope of the rainbow nation is collapsing.
Just a quick follow-up on the soul question. Given your emphasis upon dialogue and one-to-one and I-thou relations...
In the micro phase.
Yes, in the micro phase. But still, it does seem to be the effective molecule of the whole model. Do you admit collective soul or shared soul or community soul? That is, soul in Western thought is often individuated down to singular people.
Yeah.
But given that you're a community worker and now thinking about soul, do you feel the need, the impulse to posit?
This morning I heard a theory of soul that I hadn't heard, linked to the body-mind emotional matrix, and I thought it's actually how I theorise soul in that as sort of animated bodies, but I'm very clear that body, mind, and emotion are not separate, and of course we're animated by the life force, but at the same time we're animated by what we are habituated by what we choose to immerse ourselves in. So So, the soul is linked to a theory of desire and to a force. Forces, socio-economic, political, discursive forces that shape who we are. So I'm grappled with soul. Now I keep reading Hillman's Soul of the World, and I just keep reading it. And I'm not a Hillman scholar. I'm partly at Pacifica as of today to learn, and I'm kind of trying to still make sense of what his idea of soul of the world is. Now because I live in Australia, I'm gifted to live amongst one of the most ancient cultures of the world, who have a deep sense of living culture and what they would happily use the word soul to talk about their community and their culture. And it refers to the animating stories that keep their community alive. And so then it becomes linked to myth in the broadest sense of the word. And so I believe in it because I know my culture is animated by myths, myths of progress, development, technology. They animate our soul, the soul of our culture, but we don't see them. So it's a useful language to make sense of what we are experiencing. Yeah, well, metaphysics. I'm not a philosopher, so I would hate to even delve into whether there's really a soul in a metaphysical sense. And certainly, I don't believe that at a private, individual level. Or if we do, it takes us down a very dangerous cul-de-sac and takes us back into Descartesian sort of splits. So it's blah blah blah, as my Spanish friends in Australia would say, blah, blah, blah.
I just want to build on Ed's comment because it got me thinking when you talked about that. It also deals with the transformation question in a way. It's a weird question, I guess, but it's like how do you operationalize, Durkheim used to call it collective effervescence, the excitement of the group coming up. In my work, I know when I see it, but we obviously all maybe see it slightly differently, but it's something that is identifiable.
Yeah.
That synergy going.
Yep. And it's delightful and profoundly dangerous.
Yeah.
And I guess I write about in this is like ethics is so important if we're going to work with desire, eros, energy, and if we start theorising soul and some of those ideas, we have to also work very carefully around issues of ethics because that energy is what has led to murders of groups murder people quickly.
But do you feel a role yourself in, because I often do, and no, I'm not in charge of it, I'm a facilitator and critical friend. I still feel a responsibility to help guide some parts of it or have a say, my input, even if it can be ignored or put away, if I see it spiraling out of control or negativity and that sort of thing. And by modeling, by a good positive tone. Tell me where you feel.
So I think the biggest resource a community worker has is stories.
Okay. Yeah.
And so when I'm in a space where I'm lost, and that's quite often in a community process, I've got no idea what's going on, but I'm glad I'm there. And sometimes the group feels lost. What we have access to is stories of what other community, hopefully as an experienced professional community worker, you've got other stories. And or at least you can say, well, what we're grappling with here, I don't know what to do, but I know of another community that's been grappling with this. Let's connect. Let's hear their story. And that's actually, we think about capacity, and this word capacity building is used a lot in development. What capacity means is we've got confidence, networks, resources, stories. People that don't have capacity, people that think of themselves in that E.F. Schumacher tradition, the poor are convinced of their own ignorance. They're not ignorant, but they're convinced of their ignorance. So convinced of their own incapacity usually means there's a lacking of confidence and a lacking of resources or stories that can disrupt the story they feel captured, caught in, or stuck. And I define development, and maybe this will be my last word because it's a great scholarly note to end. I define development as the art of becoming unstuck. And that's it.